Yeah. So welcome to this workshop at 2:30, and I guess take it away. It's Civica and their workshop, and I guess you know what you're doing and you know what you're on about. So go ahead.
Spot on. Thank you very much, Lou. So hey guys, first of all, thank you very much for coming along. So my name is Andrew Fletcher, senior software engineer in Civica, and
I'm Liam, MA Computer Science student at Queen's and scholar/placement at Civica.
So our aim here today, just before I have a quick agenda here of what we're going to cover. Our talk today is essentially titled "Building and Releasing Your First Web Application in the Cloud." So effectively here, we're sort of looking to do a kind of an initial run through of you built your application, it's great, you've built the next Facebook, the next Twitter, whatever you've built. How do we actually put it somewhere, essentially? So just to run through a quick agenda before we kick off, we'll do just a bit of an introduction, a bit about ourselves. We'll have a look at exactly what we're going to do here. We'll have a look at what, again, I'm sure everyone's heard of the terms like DevOps and continuous integration and continuous deployment. We'll have a look at what they actually are, you know, they're buzzwords, and we'll have a look at what they actually mean in practice. From there, then we'll kind of dive into, you know, kind of what things do you need to do this process, and then how do you do it? And then finally, we're going to spend quite a bit of time at quite a bit of the workshop actually walking through this practically. So we're going to go through a very, very hello world skeleton web application and actually run through that whole process of how do we build it and deploy it on the cloud. So if you were building a bit of software, how would you actually take it and put it somewhere? And then at the end, then we'll leave a bit of time for Q&A, etc. So as I said, just a bit of introduction. So I'm a senior software engineer in Civica, working on mainly on .NET, C#, and Microsoft Azure Cloud, mainly building applications for the likes of Northern Irish local government and Department of Health. So we built software recently supporting NI government COVID response and supporting digital services in Northern Ireland. Personally, I would say cloud all the things, just put everything in the cloud because it's so much better than having it living in a server somewhere in a building in Belfast City Centre. I have a fun war story from when that building caught fire one day and knocked out half the application. So put it on the cloud. So yeah, hopefully I can give you a bit of insight into what we actually do there today. And Liam?
Yeah. So as I said, I'm a level 4 computer science student at Queen's, so I'm in my final year. I'm also on the QCS committee this year, and I'm a part-time software engineer at Civica, a day a week while I'm back at university.
So guys, just to get us kicked off then, so Liam will take us through a bit here about what we're actually looking to cover here and what our kind of aim is out of this. So Liam,
cool. So just to give you an idea of a quick run through of what we're going to do here. The aim for this is that, you know, you've built the next big thing. You've built, like Andrew said, the next Twitter, the next Facebook, a portfolio website, something like that, and you want to put it somewhere. You know, you don't want to run it on localhost on your own machine. You want to put it up on the cloud, on a server somewhere so that other people can access it. And it's not just, you know, on your laptop or something. So that brings us to the question, how do we deploy it? You know, what do we do? What are the steps involved, and how do we go about doing that and putting that somewhere that people can access it? So you've probably seen sort of diagrams like this before. You know, it's just a flow chart of steps and stages involved in, you know, taking an application and put it online. But, you know, we're going to actually dig into how you get to this point and how you get, you know, each of these different stages set up from, you know, test to build to release to, you know, publish everything online. And we're going to sort of walk through how, you know, you take your application from something that runs and builds on your own laptop or your desktop and is actually sort of automated and on the cloud and building and testing on its own just as you push changes and you know, work with the application. So it's sort of an important thing for students to cover because you know, building your application and putting it online is an essential part of any project. You know, it's all well and good having something running, you know, on your own machine, but it's important to sort of figure out how we go about putting that online.
Yeah, that is exactly. Yeah, it's about how do we put it somewhere? How do we share it with somebody? You know, how do we actually take us so that our code base can be used? So with that being said, guys, we'll dive in and let's start off then and have a look at this term DevOps. So as I said, our kind of upfront talk, you know, aim of this talk is build and release, and the kind of big buzzword in that area is this term DevOps. So let's have a look here at how we would have built and released code before. So in the past, we as developers, or any of us in writing code, built our application and it was great. And when it was done, we give it to a test team, and they go off and they tested it. And then when they're happy enough, then we give it to somebody else who goes off and deals with putting it on an environment or putting it somewhere. And then somebody else then, like I said, a support team then would deal with, you know, hitting any problems. Now, this all sounds great in theory, but what ends up happening here is isolation. Essentially, everyone works in these little individual silos. And particularly then for us as developers, you get into this big famous problem that I'm sure we've probably all heard about in software engineering, and that's the problem of it works on my machine. I've gone off and spent a week building this fantastic functionality, and it works brilliantly on my computer, but with my environment and my tools and my setup. But give it to somebody else, and it falls flat on its face, essentially. And that's just started the problem. This happens a whole way through every single stage of that pipeline. Possibly, we might know a thing that's actually very, very, very relevant to the people testing it, or very relevant to the people trying to support it in production. We might know something that's really relevant to actually releasing it. And again, so this kind of, it works on my machine, or I know this little bit, ends up happening constantly. So ultimately, DevOps is all about essentially breaking those silos. It's about essentially putting it all together. It's this combination of software development and what we would call operations. So effectively testing our code, releasing our code, and actually running our code in a production environment. DevOps is very much about a culture change, essentially. It's about the kind of culture of breaking down those barriers and putting all these stuff together effectively into one kind of into one kind of cycle where everyone's working together for the kind of for the kind of good of the project. Ultimately, then it's all about a sort of few kind of key concepts. So what it kind of comes down to practically then in terms of technology. So if we're all kind of following DevOps and following the kind of DevOps culture, first of all, it's all about automating. We don't want to have to be sitting, manually building applications and manually giving them to people to go and manually put in an environment. We want to hit a button and have that just be done. Essentially, we want building and releasing our code to be something that we do day in, day out, that becomes just like any other activity. It's as simple as getting a cup of coffee. As we kind of touched on there, it's all about integrating. The whole premise of DevOps is that everything's together. There's no more of this silo separation. Very much well then, reproducible, the kind of ability to do things in a reproducible way comes into that as well. So we don't want to be able to set up a demo for my project that only works one time on my machine. We want to be able to have a process set up that I can spin up that instance of my application anytime, really quickly, in a standardized way. Whether I'm deploying my version of the code, or Liam's changes, or Cameron's changes, or Theo's changes, I'm picking some names on the list there, it doesn't matter, essentially, because we have that process in there that knows how to take our code and put it somewhere that we can use it. And ultimately that comes together as everything is code. We're all really good at, and we all really enjoy building the application. So why not do, the environments and the deployments and the releases in the same way? Why should we code and write really, really, well-structured, well-thought-out code for the application, and then fall back down to an unmaintained 40-page deployment guide, to try and deal with putting it somewhere. That's essentially, so DevOps very much moves into this. Let's just code all that as well, because then we can manage the code and it'll all be automatic, and we can maintain it as part of the project. So finally, I just kind of wrap up some of these kind of terms then. So as part of that, that sort of brings us to this concept of continuous integration and continuous deployment. So continuous integration, or CI, ultimately is all about that automatic process by which we build, test, and package code as we make changes. So the second a developer makes a change, we're going through that loop of building the code base, testing the code base, and then building a package out of it that can be put somewhere. And then we're sort of pushing that on then to this concept of continuous deployment, where we're then taking that package and putting it on an environment, essentially. And that's sort of what we're going to look at here when we get into our walkthrough. So as we kind of kick that off, then let's have a think about what do we actually need to be able to do this process. So this all sounds great. We all look forward here to having a really, really nice, continuous integration, graph somewhere on a big screen when we're all back in the office, showing all greens across the board for all of our environments, changes constantly taken out to production, customers all happy, that all the new cool stuff is coming through the pipeline. So that's all great, but how do we actually do it? So let's have a think here about what components do we need, and what's the actual process that we're going to go through here and set up. So first things first, we need to have our code in our repository. Our code has to live somewhere. That could be GitHub, that could be GitLab, it could be a repository up on Azure. There's numerous standard places that our repository that our code base can live. Next, then we need to have quite a lot of scripts. So as we kind of said there, that whole process, or that whole concept of automation, becomes very, very important under DevOps. So we need to think. If I was going to go through and we're all used to be able to fire Visual Studio and hit the green start button to run our application, but how do we actually take that and take that process and extract it into a set of commands that can tell the likes of the web server or the tooling involved how to build and run our code base. It's not enough now to hit the button and call it a day. We have to figure out what are the actual steps so that we can tell these various tools to do those steps for us automatically. We also need to think about where it's going to go. Again, it's really nice being able to run our application locally, hit a button and it goes. But in terms of putting it somewhere that a person can use it, we need to have somewhere for it to run. Is that going to be an on-premises server? Is that going to be a cloud environment? Is that going to be, some hosting being provided by, the university or your company or whatever else? We need to have a think about where we're actually going to put it. And then finally, we need to think about the tooling that's involved. Again, to be able to automate things, we need build tools, we need release tools, we need, we need tools that understand how to put our application onto the cloud. So all these things play a role in that sort of overall continuous integration, continuous deployment, automate it, get our code from our repository to somewhere that it can be used type process. And then when we kind of put all these together, then we come ultimately to this sort of standard process that every single kind of build and release pipeline, as we like to call them, sort of follows. Whatever technology, whatever platform it's using, whatever tooling it's using, they all sort of generally follow this sort of step. So we start off with a repository that has code stored in it. And I said that could generally be something like GitHub or something like Azure DevOps. And every single time we do a change, then we automatically kick off a build. As part then of a build, we go off and we fetch any things our application needs. Applications nowadays are built on the shoulders of giants, as it were. We don't start from absolute zero. We don't try and build our own login systems. We don't try and build our own encryption systems. We use really good libraries for those, as we should. It's best. When we're focused on solving our problems, not problems that have been solved over and over again. So our applications are going to have dependencies and external things. So part of our build, we need to go get those. As well, then we need to be able to actually go and test our code. As we said, as we build here, it's very important we have test coverage as well. We want to make sure that before we actually ever are in a position to put a bit of code out there on an environment that we know actually works. There's no point deploying something that's completely broken that just results in angry customers and late night Friday evenings trying to fix production. Never fun. So finally, then, artifacts. It's once we actually build the project, ultimately we need to have something then that we can deploy. Essentially, we need to actually take our built code and have this unit, this thing that represents the result of processing our code base that goes somewhere. And then the final stage then is taking that unit and putting it somewhere. So we very much keep that split. We have a build process that takes our code and makes a package, and a release process that takes our package, configures it for the environment that it's in. So maybe that means pointing it at a production, at a production service rather than a test service. Maybe that means setting it into production mode rather than test mode. Doing all that kind of specific configuration that goes with putting code in a live environment. So what we'll see here when we get into our walkthrough shortly is these are the kind of steps we'll go through as we go through and ultimately implement this process on our test application. So with that, guys, we'll jump straight into a walkthrough here. I think I always like to jump into a code base and have a look. As we're kind of saying at the start, the session's being recorded. So again, we're going to provide the application here that we're using for this, and a few links for you guys as well if you just want to go and follow through this. So after the workshop, just to be clear, do feel free to take this away and work through it. We've tried to leave this such that you should have everything you need to be able to to kind of run through it. So the kind of scenario that we're going to cover here is we're going to actually go in here and look at taking a very, very light Hello World application that we've built in Visual Studio, and we're going to actually try and put it onto the cloud in an automated process. Now, to do that, we're going to use a couple of tools, and I'll let Liam talk through these just in terms of what they are and how you guys as students can get access to them.
Cool. So Azure itself is, the cloud platform we all know and love. It provides you with a lot of different tools and services that you can use for, the kind of things that we're going to be doing here. But the good news is that, those tools aren't inaccessible to you as students. Being a student, you get access to those services and stuff like that for free. And you get, I believe it's $100 of credit just for being a student that you can use to fund, different parts of Azure that have some cost associated with them. I know some people are often scared about cloud services because, you leave them running, for example, and it burns through your credit and it starts charging you money. Not a problem with Azure. You don't have to give any payment information or anything like that. You log in with your student ID and that's it. You're good to go. You get your $100 of credit off the bat. So it's good to have. It's good to get set up. There's no payment information required. And I've used it before for university projects and hackathon projects. and even just personal things as well. So it's definitely good to have. DevOps is the other Azure platform for managing, project management in general. So that's like hosting your repository and source control, similar to GitHub, managing like project management things like Kanban boards and different things like that. Things like pull request management as far as source control is concerned. And it also ties into things like your pipelines. So there's sections within DevOps for pipelines and things like that. But we'll get into that. DevOps is completely free, the basic tier, and I believe some of that's encapsulated in your student identity as well. So worth checking out. They're the things we're going to be using today in this walkthrough.
So guys, Stephen's just put it on the chat as well. Yeah, just to say, Azure for students, no card deals required at all, and check out his Twitter there for some details. And certainly, again, Liam and I have both used these as well, very, very regularly. These are the same tools that we use day to day as well in our projects, delivering large scale projects for customers. So again, learning these tools now. If you come to us, the company, and say, I know Azure DevOps, I've built a release pipeline, we're immediately going, brilliant, that's fantastic. That's absolutely brilliant. And as Stephen says, locally developed as well, which is always a good thing. so with that, guys, we'll jump in here and we'll just get stuck into a walkthrough of this. So again, we're going to kind of walk through the sort of steps that are involved in this. So first things first, just to start off, I have an application. So I have a code base here on GitHub that contains an application. We're going to have a look at the application now, but effectively we have starting off here with a repository containing a very, very lightweight web application. In this case, I've happened to build it in ASP.NET using C# and Visual Studio. But these principles that we're going to cover, the application here is essentially just a kind of a test subject. These kind of principles apply whether you're working in Python, Java, Ruby, whatever your technology of choice happens to be. So just to have a look then at my application. So what I've effectively set up here is the very, very standard off the shelf, hello world page that you get when you go, file new website in Visual Studio 2019. So if I fire it up here, let's just have a quick look at it. Like it's tiny, but let's have a look at it and see just what we have out of the box and what we've made it do. So straight away, we get a page, system hello world. It shows the time in the page loaded, and it shows an important message. It's tiny. It's going to be the next big thing someday, but today it's tiny. So in terms of that as well, within our solution, then we have our application. We have a couple of tests as well. And again, as as we go through, our kind of best practices of how we build software, testing is always very, very important. It's important, that as we build our software, we have tests there for it as well to make sure that it's doing what we need it to do. So as it stands today, I built this project. It's great. I can run it really, really well. It's all good. I can hit the green button of Visual Studio and it's good to go. But let's say now I want to send it to any of you guys. Currently, as it stands at the minute running this, it's running on my machine, which makes it, again, it's, if my machine's turned off, it's not going to work. It's not really very easy to share. It's not ideal. And equally as well, if we're going to change it, we want it to be running somewhere else, where it is still running, essentially. So we're going to take this application and run through how we would put a build pipeline around it and how we would put a release pipeline around it. So to get started on that, we're going to pull up Azure DevOps. So pulling up Azure DevOps here, I'll just land on the home page. Azure DevOps lives at just dev.azure.com, or just a quick Google search for, if I could spell, search for Azure DevOps, search result in Google, and then you can log in from here. In my case, I'm using my work account. Again, you can use your student, your university accounts, or make a new one. Again, there's no charge for the basic tier. So straight away looking on here, we see then I have this project set up essentially. So this essentially is my space on Azure DevOps, where I can go off and essentially start managing my project and start implementing these build pipelines. As Liam sort of touched on, Azure DevOps is, although we're looking today specifically at the kind of build and release infrastructure side of Azure DevOps as a tool covers essentially every single stage of that software engineering process. So we would use this day to day in our projects to manage our work items, to manage our code reviews, to manage our testing, and to take care of knowledge, things like wikis and all, taking care of knowledge that's relevant to our projects. So essentially, this gives our teams one place to go for every single aspect of our projects. You're not having to look across 3 or 4 systems. You pull it up in Azure DevOps. and everything is there. It's quite common in our teams to hear us say, go look on ADO, because that's it's kind of our place to go for all things engineering, effectively. So in our case today, we're going to particularly be looking at the kind of pipelines and build and release pipelines. In this case here, I've already created my project, but if I was making a project, it's literally a case of hit new project, give it a name, and specify whether it's public or private, and hit create. I'll use one here that I've already made, just since I already have it here, one I prepared earlier, as it were. So let's start off then with that process. So we've got our code in our repository. That's great. So let's have a think now about how do we actually build that code? How do we take that code, build a package of it that we can go and put somewhere? So let's go and have a look here, first of all, in pipelines. So what Azure DevOps calls a pipeline, effectively, is this place that basically knows how to allow you to define a process to take code and build it, essentially. So if I want to actually take my code base now and start deploying it, all I need to do is jump in here, click new pipeline, and DevOps then will start basically and ask me, where does your code live? So in our case, we're going to tell it that it lives on GitHub at the moment. And having done that, then it's going to go off and show all my repositories, and I'm going to pick the one I want. So in my case, it's our system 2021 Cloud App Web Editor. And it'll go off and have a look at it, and it'll ask me, right, so what kind of project is it? So in our case, we know that it's an ASP.NET project. So in our case, it's an ASP.NET Core project. But as we can see here, there's templates there for umpteen different kinds of applications. There's templates there for things like for Java, for Node.js, for apps, for PHP, for Python, for all the kind of common stacks that we would use as developers to build applications. And by selecting one of these, then Azure DevOps actually will do a lot of the work for us. So in our case, if I go and select ASP.NET Core, essentially what it'll do is it'll drop me then into this file then, where effectively it basically gives me this environment where I can go now and essentially tell it what do I want to do effectively, what's involved in my pipeline. So what we'll do is, so straight out of the bat, what it'll generate is this default first step of go off and do a build. So this kind of ties us into that kind of second requirement of what we need to do continuous build and continuous release. Normally, we would fire up Visual Studio, we hit the button, and it's good to go. That's all well and good locally, but when we're looking at an automatic process, again, the computer needs to know much the same as when we're actually writing code. The system needs to know what we're telling it to do. It needs to know how to build our application. So in doing that, let's have a think about that. So if we were building our application, taking Visual Studio out of the equation, what we would do is we would use the tooling that comes with our application. So in the case of .NET, that will be the .NET tooling. So when you're using the .NET or the .NET platform, they ship it with tons of tools to allow you to do various sort of key tasks in the build process. So there are command line tools that allow you to go off and fetch any dependencies your application has. There are tools that allow you to go off and run your tests and make sure they all pass and generate a report, etc. And there are tools that allow you to go off and publish your application. So one of the first things to figure out effectively when you're starting to build a build pipeline is what actually are the steps to actually build our project. So let's have a think about that then. So for us in a .NET project, the first thing we need to do is go get all our packages. The first thing is .NET Restore, which effectively tells the .NET platform, I have a project that has dependencies, go off and fetch them from the internet and pull them all down. In which case then my environment's going, happy days, you've got them all, you're all good. Next for us then is running our tests. Again, before we even consider building code, we want to know that it's actually sensible. And as we've seen, I have a test in there that runs, a couple of checks on our logic. So similarly to restore, we have a test command. So again, .NET will go off and look at what we have in our project, find all our tests and run them. And in this case, it's all good. It's all green. We know they've all passed. Happy days. Final step then is go off and actually do a publish. So how do I take our source code and make it into something that we can put on the cloud? So finally then we have this publish command, and I'm going to tell it I want to put my code into this output folder. And what essentially will happen there is it will take my code base, it will build it in a kind of a release friendly mode. And then if I go have a look here, what I effectively then have is this set of files that represents the built version of my code base. So at this point, this is now something that has been put together, compiled, and something now that I can take and actually put somewhere, essentially. So from our point then, essentially, what we've basically worked out there is that our build process to go from code in the repository to thing that we can put somewhere is about 3 or 4 steps. Effectively, it is get our code, restore our dependencies, run our tests, and publish. Effectively. So to that end, then that immediately gives us what can go into our build pipeline in terms of defining that automated process. So in terms then of what actually goes here in our steps, what we're essentially then doing is defining a number of tasks, effectively then that effectively goes through and does this process. And again, I'll grab one here that I prepared earlier just because I have it handy. So we actually have a look at what's in this pipeline. What we essentially have, first of all, we have a .NET restore command. And basically what it's doing is it's using that same .NET tooling and running restore, the same way we had done locally. We have a .NET test command in here, which again is running the .NET tooling and running the test command. We then have a publish command, which similarly is pointed at our project, is building it, and is putting it into a folder. And the very last step is that we have what's called a publish artifact command. And a publish artifact essentially tells Azure DevOps, take the result of my build process and expose it to the kind of wider store, so that our build process basically can take our code, run a set of steps, and kick out a result at the end. Effectively, this final step is what tells it, I have a result that I want you to make available, essentially. So when all comes together, what we now have in our repository, and again, this file ends up going into our repository as another piece of our code base. In the same way we would have HTML and C#, etc. We look now in our repository, we have this file called Azure Pipelines that effectively defines every single step required to take our code base and build it into something that can be put somewhere. And as we've essentially then gone through and defined that, we now actually have in the code base this piece of logic or this piece of configuration that tells Azure DevOps how to build our code base. If ever we need to do anything else, we can modify that. Essentially, it becomes very, very easy then to pull down the repository, use this to tell Azure DevOps what to do, and have it build the code. So bouncing them back into pipelines, that essentially then gives us then this sort of unit here where we can run individual builds, and a build then effectively runs our various different steps, produces a set of test results, essentially a package at the end. So if I actually have a look at what this build process actually does, it goes off and it grabs our code base. You can see they're actually going off and fetching it from GitHub. It goes off then and it does our restore, all good, gets our dependencies. It goes off and it runs our tests. And again, we see the same one test was passed. It goes off then and it builds our project. It publishes it at the end, and it's telling us all good, green text down the board. We know that our build is passed. We now have something that we can actually go and deploy. And indeed, if we jump back here and have a look, we have here a published artifact. And if we go and look at it, then it essentially is that same file we were looking at locally, where it's the actual built, packaged up, content that becomes our project. And indeed as well, and if we have a look here under tests, we have Azure DevOps telling us that all our tests have passed. Happy days. And we can dive into them and see that our tests are taking about 4 seconds to run. We can have a look there and see, what all tests that run and were there any failures, etc. It gives us that kind of way to get a really good overview straight away of how's our code base actually looking. Are there any problems we need to be aware of? Are tests taking ages? Are there tests that are flaky or unreliable? Effectively, we have an immediate sort of way to have a look at that. And straight away here we can see all good, everything's green. We're happy, brilliant. So what that gives us now is we now have, we've now run a build essentially. We now have essentially a thing we can deploy. How do we now take it and actually put it somewhere? Now, as we're touching on there back in our process, we've now done our build. We've now got our artifact. Our next stage is this process of releasing it. Now, when we're looking at this sort of build and release, we do very much keep a stringent split between build and release. Build is the process of code base to package, whereas release is the process of package to a particular place with any configuration that particular place requires. Be that possibly it's service connections or database connections or turning off a test mode or something like that. So in that same vein, then again, Azure DevOps as a tool keeps a very, very stringent split there as well. So we have this separate tool called release pipelines. And what they then effectively do is exactly that. They let us take our code base they let us take our package that we've built in a build pipeline and define a process by which we actually release it, essentially. So if I have a look here in one of these, what we effectively have here is this, again, is this sort of pipeline structure where basically we're saying, taking this artifact that comes from this build pipeline, run the set of jobs on it. So if I'm looking to define one of these, again, it's really, really simple. I can press create release. Sorry, no, I cannot. I can press the correct thing, which might be helpful. I can find the correct one. Yep, I can press new release pipeline. I can tell Azure roughly what I'm doing. So in our case, we're going to be deploying up onto Azure. Now, Azure as a platform has many different services covering every single kind of application. In our case, we're deploying essentially a web application. So we'll be deploying it on what's called an Azure App Service. And we'll have a look here in just in a few minutes at what's involved in making one of those. But straight away, then I can pick a template that matches roughly what I'm doing, and DevOps will do most of the process for me and get a lot of the kind of lifting done. So in our case, I'll grab App Service Deployment, and straight away then it sets up with an initial stage and an initial task essentially. So first things first, we can tell it what are we actually going to deploy. So in our case, we're saying you're deploying something that comes from our build pipeline. And then in our case, then it'll then pick up the fact that we have a web app build pipeline there. So we're now basically saying that this deployment comes from this artifact that comes from this build pipeline. And then these jobs then within these various stages then can use away at the various artifacts that have been published by that build pipeline. So I straight away then can use this release pipeline to essentially tell Azure DevOps the steps required to take my package that I built in my build pipeline and put it up onto the cloud. So that then brings us into the kind of final piece of the puzzle. We need to have somewhere to actually put our application and somewhere to actually put it. So in the same way we have Azure DevOps as our tool to actually define our build pipeline, if we then have Azure as the place that our code is actually going to go. So if I shoot across to the Azure portal, as Liam says, this is, and again, as Stephen's mentioned there as well, this is all, again, Azure itself is completely free in terms of a service that you can use. Again, I'm using my my Azure subscription that I get through work. But again, you guys as students are free to get an Azure subscription and use away at this sort of technology. If I go onto Azure, then effectively, I can essentially then go off and actually create a place for my application to go. So in this case here, I've created a system group on Azure to put my applications. And I've defined a system app service on Azure, which is effectively a place for my application to go. Now, again, when I'm making things in Azure, Azure does as much as it can to try and help us out. So it has templates there for every single manner of application, covering websites and databases and machine learning applications and all sorts of different things. In our case here, then we've used the web app base to effectively, and at that point, then Azure will take us through this process of defining a website. So it'll ask us essentially what subscriptions are under or what groups in. So in our case, it's under our system group. It'll ask us what our site's called. Looking down as well, it'll ask us what's it built on. Is it .NET? Is it Java? Is it PHP, Python, whatever? It'll ask where you want to put it. So in our case, we've selected UK South, personally as a matter of preference. But again, if you have certain requirements to have your application in a certain place due to legal restrictions, you're free to do so. And then it asks basically how big do you want it to be, what kind of size is involved. And again, Azure, Azure will let you sort of pick, whatever, so, a range of sizes ranging from tiny free websites to really, really large, websites, that have 10 instances and, hundreds and hundreds of gigs of memory. And as Liam touched on there earlier, because you're not required for card details here, if you max out your limit playing with this stuff, it doesn't matter. It'll just stop you doing anything else, essentially. So you're never ever going to be in a scenario with this where you're able to tear through hundreds of points. So similar to before, I've defined an app service already. So I have an app service here called System 2021 Hello World, and it's got a URL, and it's now running up there on Azure as somewhere that I can essentially access as a user and push code to. So with that there, then what we'll do is we'll bounce back to Azure DevOps and we'll go and finish up configuring our release pipeline to actually take our package artifact and put it onto the cloud. So first thing it'll ask is, what Azure subscription are you interested in? So again, you as a user can have a few different Azure subscriptions. I get quite a few for work. I'm going to pick this one here, one of my Visual Studio ones, and it'll go off then and look, and it'll see, okay, what app services or what spaces on Azure do I have where I can deploy to. And if I look down the list here, just think about it for a moment. It is, nope, that's the wrong one, because not in my case it's a Linux one. If I look down the list here, and yep, it'll pick up the fact that I've made an app service called System 2021 Hello World. So DevOps as a tool here is aware that there is an app service up on Azure where I can put my application. So I select that. Everything else then is done for us. We don't actually have to do anything else. You know, Azure DevOps as a platform, you know, already configures the whole release pipeline to go off, you know, to actually grab our zip package and put it up there. So all I do is I hit save, and I kick off a release, which essentially tells Azure DevOps I want to take the latest build of my code base and put it on the cloud. And I hit create. And then similarly then to our build pipeline, we'll get to start a nice green graph. Again, this is a bit simpler than the ones that we covered. These don't have as many stages and branches as they need. So to give an example, like I've one application that work that I take care of day to day has about 4 different portals that it deploys and database services that it sets up, and we have individual stages then that cover those various pipelines, or that cover those various parts of the deployment. But what we basically see here is our job kicks off. Azure DevOps then grabs my package, runs it through then this sort of stage with its 3 tasks. If we dive into the tasks there, we can see it going off and essentially, you know, starting up the job, fetching our artifact, and then running that process that effectively takes our artifact and puts it onto our space in the cloud. And once this is done, then it'll go through and it'll do our process, and all being well, we'll get a green tick at the end, which is always what we're looking to see when we're doing anything automated around continuous integration and continuous deployment. You're having a bad day when you quote break the build, which in our team is normally a bunnable offense when we're in the office. Bit tricky at the moment. But yeah, in this case, all good. My code is had built properly, and my code is now released properly. So happy days. I've got my green tick, having a good day, not bringing the team donuts today. And if I now then grab this URL then from Azure and fire it up, navigate to it, happy days, boom, we now have our application running up on the cloud, essentially. Yeah, as I just said, yeah, bunnable offense, you bring in buns. So yeah, guys, so just the guys essentially then to sort of recap, what we essentially then have done there is we've gone through that entire process of taking our application from code, having it on a repository, going through then an entire process of defining, essentially defining and telling the Azure DevOps tooling how to build our code base. So basically, the kind of main steps involved in that around getting it from the repository, doing a restore, doing a test run, and then publishing it to give us something that we can put onto the cloud. We've then taken that package and again told Azure how to, essentially how to release it, how to connect up to Azure and take our package and put it there. We've gone and created a place for our application to go. And ultimately now then we have our application running on a URL that we can give to anybody on the cloud, that we can, we can work away at our changes locally without affecting what's there in the live site. We can pass that out for demos or for, or publish it somewhere. And essentially then, we can kick off that build at any time as easily as we want. If we wanted to go and make a change and kick off a new build, we can do that. Really, we can do that. We make our change, we kick off the repository, we kick off our code bases. Just guys, to wrap up, I'm aware we're out of time here. I want to leave a bit of time for QAs at the end. We've run through this, obviously, showing it kind of being manually triggered. But again, as part of these as well, we can set up all different kinds of automatic triggers. So if I want to tell Azure DevOps that actually this pipeline should run automatically for every single change, I can do that. If I want to mandate that every single change people make have to be ran through the build pipeline first. So one way that we would work in our team is that people will go off and do their changes on their own wee copies of the repository or on their own branches. They will request for their changes to be pulled back into the main code base. Someone on the team will review them. We can actually then mandate that before your code can ever be merged and shipped, that it has to pass the build pipeline. And as part of that, we can do whatever checks we need. We can do security checks. We can do code quality check, we can run tests. So as part of our applications, we actually go off and do a set of automated security scans to make sure that the code that our teams are writing are hitting all those best practices. And that's all stuff then that we get automatically, and that's what, all those extra checks then we're able to kind of catch straight away. Yeah, and then similar then with our release pipeline, we can set up release pipelines for as many environments as we want. If we have, if we have test servers, if we have pre-production servers, production boxes, we can define as many pipelines as we want. And again, we can set those to trigger as well. We can also set up approval gates on them, essentially. So if we have a look there at that pipeline that we demoed back, that we kind of showed back at the beginning, this is a much larger pipeline that has, kind of 5 different components involved. Each component has a number of steps involved to actually go through and do that process. We have an approval up front, effectively. That essentially says, someone on the team has to actually approve that deployment. And again, we can make these as in-depth as we require and get to that absolute gold standard where essentially making a new environment becomes nothing more than pressing a button or cloning a pipeline. Essentially, everything is managed in code in the repository. We're not have to go and spend a weekend building a web server somewhere, that has to be patched and maintained and all that sort of good stuff. So, guys, that brings us to the end of our walkthrough. I hope everyone's found that really, really useful, and I hope that's given essentially a bit of an insight into what's involved in this process. As Liam touched on at the start, this is a kind of a process that you'll see in most every single sort of professional environment. And it's one of the things that definitely so it's one of the first things we do when we start off a new project in our teams in Civica. If we get a new project, before we even start to build any code in it, we're making sure that all this infrastructure is in place, because having this infrastructure in place then supports us to build as good a project as possible. Essentially, the whole way through our builds, if we know that essentially essentially our build server and our build processes become essentially part of the team, we effectively know that that stuff's got our back. It's making sure that our code is as good as possible, effectively. So, guys, if there's any questions, we'd be happy to address them in the last few minutes. Myself and Lane will be about as well, so feel free to pop us a message or get in touch. I should have put our Twitter handles up there, but I'll chuck them on. I'll chuck them on the chat there as well. And yeah, guys, I always find that useful. And if there's any questions, let me know.
Yeah, and just to mention as well, this is recorded, so if you have missed this or you want to go back over it or follow it along, you can do so anytime after. I think System are publishing everything on YouTube at some point. Yeah. It's really good stuff to know. Speaking as a student, this kind of stuff, despite being very relevant and useful to both industry and projects in general, isn't covered in university as much. And it's something that tends to get left out, and only now we're in Queen's at least we're starting to see modules cover cloud as a concept. So it's useful stuff to have sort of under your belt if you're ever tackling a personal project, a hackathon, even a thing for university, an assignment. It's just handy to have.
And indeed, yeah, if you're interviewing then for placement or for graduate jobs, if you're coming to us and saying, I've built these projects, exactly as Stephen said there, if you come to us and said, I've built a final year project, I have, put it on a repository, I've put a build and release engineering process around it. If you're coming to us and saying, I can do all that, we're immediately going, happy days, because it shows that kind of understanding of all that process that goes around, that kind of development, essentially that gets our code, because ultimately our code is great and we love writing code, but we want to write code that ultimately gets to production and gets in front of a user, because that's what it's all about.
And not only can you talk about these things, but you can show them off as well.
Yes.
Bring a laptop to an interview, bring a tablet. You can fire up your link to your app service on Azure and show someone your application deployed and accessible, online. And you've got those kind of nice visual guides that you get out of Azure, all things you can show off and talk about fairly easily in any sort of interview or technical setting.
And indeed, there, as Stephen says, yeah, it doesn't have to be Azure DevOps. We're not fussed if it is AWS, Azure, and other. It's about the process. We in Civica have used, I think, 3 different build tools over the last sort of 5 years. Azure DevOps most recently is sort of our standard now. But it's the same challenges you hit, the same processes. It's the same kind of approaches. From our point of view, we're really interested in seeing people who are really interested, really keen, people who have a kind of passion, the exact technologies are a detail nearly, portfolios or what it's all about, essentially.
Yeah. And if Azure isn't your cup of tea, check out AWS or any of the other cloud providers. All of them have free credit in different forms, and the concepts we've talked about apply to all of them. Obviously, some of the specific steps may differ slightly, but the concepts hold across the board.
That, guys, concludes our workshop. So, guys, thank you very, very much. And as we said, I think Leo will hand back to your good self. And if there are, guys, any questions or anything, please, feel free to reach out to myself or Liam. Our Twitter handles are on there. And I said, feel free to grab the recording when it's out, work through this. That repository is up in GitHub as well. And we'll be in our Civica booth for any further questions. And other than that, guys, enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks very much. That was a great talk, very informative, and a good challenge getting all that into 45 minutes. That's probably hard, I imagine. It's very good, very informative, and thank you very much. And like I said, if you have any other questions, they'll be in their booth, so you can contact them there. And we'll obviously, after asking, upload the recordings of this, probably slightly edited so it's a bit shorter, and on our YouTube, so you can then go back and have a look at that and give this a go yourselves. So thanks again, and
cool.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a great rest of the day.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Perfect.